Yes, my name is John Critzas, and that's spelled C-R-I-T-Z-A-S.
And you tell me where and when you were born.
My date of birth is April 26th, coming up pretty soon, 1925. So,
And where were you born?
in New York City.
And tell me something about your life before World War II.
Well, before World War II, in 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, I was 16 years old. And I distinctly remember being at some friends of my parents' home, having lunch, and that's about the time in St. Louis that we heard about it. And their son was a serviceman in uniform. And the announcement came over the radio, all military personnel report to your base. So I had no idea at age 16 I would ever be involved in the Second World War.
What brought your family to St. Louis?
Well, my father was a civil engineer, and he came here to do design work and building for Anheuser-Busch, which this was the center of their operations. And we were living in New York until I was about 12 years old, and that goes back to 1936. And we moved to St. Louis at that time for my father's work, and he thought it would be temporary, and he stayed here permanently.
And tell me what happened after 1941, after Pearl Harbor.
Well, I was in high school, of course, in 1941 at age 16, and I was in my junior year, and the war progressed, and at the a year later, when I turned 17, I graduated, which is 1942. I graduated from high school, University City High School, and started immediately at Washington University to study chemical engineering. And when April came around, I had finished a semester of chemical engineering, and I was starting in the second semester. We had trimesters then. We had summer semester and then the fall and the spring. And the day I turned 18, which was April the 26th, 1943, I received a notice from the draft board. And it said, your friends and neighbors have selected you, report to the draft, which is what I did. And 3 days later, I found myself at Jefferson Barracks in a military uniform, ready to go to Texas to go through basic training. So it took them 3 days after my 18th birthday to get the young men that were physically fit into the service. Of course, we all wanted to go at that time. That was the mental mindset of all of the young men.
So how did you feel about that quick indoctrination?
Well, it didn't bother me. I mean, my biggest fear was being rejected, because at the time I had just turned 18, and even today I'm not very big, and at that time I only weighed 110 pounds when I was inducted into the Army. And I weighed in at 110, and when I was discharged I was 160. So the military made a big difference because of the regular diet and the exercise and the activity and everything. It did well for me.
And where were you based before you went overseas?
The last training base that we had was Camp Barkley, Texas, which is just outside of a small town called Abilene, Texas.
And what date did you arrive in Europe, and what city?
We arrived in Europe about 30 days after D-Day. And we first went to England because we had no equipment. And we went over in a large convoy of ships. And our first experience with anything military was depth charges because the U-boats were chasing the convoy. And we heard these explosions going off, and we asked the sailors on board what was going on, and they said there's a submarine in the area and we're throwing depth charges over the side to try and run him away because we don't need that. So we thought, well, here we are in the middle of the ocean. It took us 15 days to cross the Atlantic in a convoy because we zigzagged throughout the trip, and it took a long time to get there. So when we got to England, we were issued our equipment, all brand new, our personal weapons, and then our tanks, which we had to clean and prepare for firing. And from there, it was September, we got on an LST, which is a landing ship tank. And there are 17 tanks on one of these things. And keep in mind that a tank weighs 70,000 pounds. So you can do some quick multiplication. 70,000 pounds times 17 or 15. I don't remember the exact number now, but it's a lot of weight. And that's the kind that has the big door on the front that drops down and allows you to disembark on the shore. So we went across the channel, which was very rough in that time, at that time of year. The invasion had progressed to the point where the Allied armies had a pretty good foothold in Europe, in Normandy and beyond. Paris was not yet liberated. It was still occupied by the Germans. And we went up the Seine River in France to a little city called Rouen. And we disembarked in Rouen, which was very close to the front lines. And from there we progressed forward to Paris and engaged in the liberation of Paris. Actually, there wasn't any fighting involved. We just kind of drove through. But the French people were all over the place. They were ecstatic to see the American military.
Tell me the date of your disembarkment in Rouen.
In Rouen? Well, I would say September. I don't remember the... 1944. 1944.
And tell me what happened after the liberation of Paris.
Well, after the liberation of Paris, then we were assigned to the 7th Army, which was commanded by General Patch, and he handled the Ardennes and the southern part of France and the southern part of Germany, or the Bavarian Alps, if you will. And as we were going, after we joined the 7th Army, as we were going east, chasing the German army, I could see through the telescope in the tank the Alps. And I said to myself at that time as a 19-year-old, I'm going to come back here one day because they are beautiful. And I did that more than once.
Right. And then?
Well, and then as we progressed through the remainder of 1944, our armored division, just for a little clarification, consisted of 12,000 men. And our first major engagement, now we had skirmishes all along the way, but our first major engagement was in a small city called Herlesheim, which was sometimes Germany and sometimes France. It was right there on the Rhine River. And the Germans defended that very strongly because they didn't want it to fall into our hands. Well, that particular engagement, which lasted about 4 or 5 days, took half of our entire division. 1,000 men were killed and are still over there, buried in the various cemeteries, the majority of them. And the other 4,000 or 5,000 were wounded or out of action for one reason or another. So we had, out of a 12,000 man division, we had 6,000 replacements. Our particular vehicle, our tank, the tank is 5 men. 3 men in the turret and 2 men, 1 man driving and another man, assistant driver, down below. And we lost 3 of those men in one engagement with the enemy. So we had 3 brand new replacements.
And tell me what your position was in the tank.
Oh, I was a gunner. My assigned job was to operate the 76 millimeter cannon, which is the large gun that you see on the front of the tank.
And after that engagement, that battle engagement, tell me what happened.
Well, after Herlesheim, we continued to progress up to the Rhine River, but we did not cross it. Then the commanding general of the Third Army, who was George Patton, commandeered our entire division, told us to remove all of our insignia and paint out all of the markings on our vehicles because he didn't want the Germans to know that he was confiscating a whole division and moving them up to Trier, France, which is in the northern part of France. He wanted to beat Montgomery, the English general Montgomery, to the Rhine. He wanted to get to the Rhine first, which is what we did. So in a 3-day period, we drove the entire division of 12,000 men, equipment, half-tracks, infantry, everything. We drove 50 miles a day, which is moving pretty rapidly. And we drove 150 miles, and we wound up at Remagen, the bridgehead at Remagen, which they promptly blew up in our face. And but they didn't destroy it completely because infantry could still get across. So we had to go further south and look for another bridge that was intact, which is what we did. We drove south and we got as far south as Dillingen. And these are kind of hard to find on the map, but they're maybe 100 miles south, 150 miles south.
Is that in Germany?
Yeah, across the Rhine was Germany then. And we crossed the Rhine at that point and continued to chase the German army. They were fighting at that time a rearguard action. In other words, it wasn't a front where we had major engagements. The major engagement was Herlesheim, right before the Rhine River. Once the Rhine was crossed, the majority of the Germans, the Wehrmacht, more or less assumed that Germany had lost the war, and they were surrendering by the thousands. We were taking so many prisoners, we didn't know what to do with them. We just told them to start walking towards the rear. And of course, we were in a tank. We were not in a position to herd the prisoners that we took. That was the infantry's job and the rear echelon's job to move them to the back. But they were happy to submit to the American Army.
Tell me about your first encounter with a concentration camp.
After we crossed the Rhine River at Dillingen, we drove inland with moderate resistance. And so that the people that are listening to this can understand, a lot of people visualize from the movies that the infantry forms a big line and they walk and engage the enemy. Well, this Second World War was not like that. We went right down the main highway. Many times it was the Autobahn in Germany, the big 4-lane highway. We drove our tanks straight down the main highway with nothing in front of us but the German army. And occasionally they would leave rearguard action. They would leave an anti-tank gun or a large 88 millimeter gun to delay or stop our column, to keep us from progressing too fast. But we were going inland from the Rhine River after Dillingen into the heart of Germany. And about 50 miles or 80 miles inland, we encountered an area that we didn't understand what it was. We could smell it from about 10 miles away. And it took us an hour or so to cover that 10 miles. It was a terrible smell, and it's something that we all still remember. And when we saw this prison, what we thought was a prison or a concentration camp, and it had 10-foot walls all around it, and it had a gate. So my tank commander instructed our driver, just break through the wall. Don't even go through the gate. It might be mined, it might be bombs in that area or whatever. Let's just go through the wall. And 70,000 pounds of steel is not a match for even a 10 or 15-inch wall made out of brick. It just crumbles in front of you, and you just drive through it. And we drove through the wall and stopped on the other side because we didn't know what was in there. And we saw a lot of inmates with horizontal black and white striped suits. And they all, when we stopped, they all came running up, and there were some that knew English. And we found out that the vast majority of them were Jewish prisoners of war. And this, we discovered, was a concentration camp because we could see bodies that had not yet been exterminated. And the photograph that I have in the picture there shows some of that extermination. And for a 19-year-old to see that live was quite a shock, because I didn't understand it, and I didn't understand who could do that, and how could they do that.
Tell me what your first thought was when you saw what was there.
Well, when we saw what was there, you mean the prisoners? We thought, well, it's just a prison. It's a prison camp. But after they explained this, oh no, they have ovens here, and they are burning the people after they die. They're exterminating them. And obviously we were pretty mad. So we only got to stay there for the remainder of that day, and General Eisenhower and General Patton and General Montgomery and General Patch, they were all called to that scene. And that prison camp was called Landsberg. And it was one of the main extermination points, and there were 10 satellite camps surrounding that. And don't ask me the names of them because I don't remember them. But Landsberg was one of the central camps that had a series of ovens and areas where they were burning or cremating the bodies.
Tell me the date of that day you spent there at Landsberg.
It was early April. It was very close to my birthday, my 20th birthday. 1945, I'm sorry. 1945. The war ended in May, but we had our principal engagement in January of 1945 at Herlisheim. And between that date and the end of March, we crossed the Rhine River, encountered the concentration camp, and then were ordered by General Patton to continue, don't stay here, continue chasing the Germans. And I guess I didn't finish what I started to say before. Today's warfare, 1945 warfare in the Second World War, the tanks went first down the highway. The infantry followed us in half-tracks because they couldn't walk at the rate of speed we were going. And whenever we encountered any resistance, then the infantry would dismount and we'd fan out and find out where the resistance was coming from, eliminate it, and keep on going down the road.
Tell me who talked to you at the camp, prisoners or guards or anybody else?
Yeah, just the people that were fluent in English. Some of them knew German, and I was able to converse a little bit in German with the ones that couldn't speak English, because I was conversational in German anyway. They talked to me, and we asked, what's going on here? And they said, the Germans are gone. They're all gone, and The ones that surrendered have gone back west, and we were proceeding east, and they were begging for food. And when we first went in there, not just our tank, but the other tanks in the platoon that followed were also fanned out inside the prison camp. It's a fairly large facility. And the prisoners that came up to us were begging for food. They hadn't had food or water. They were all emaciated, you know. They were all barely alive. And we gave them whatever we had until we were ordered not to, because our medics told us that the food would kill them. They're not used to food rations like we were getting. Though they have to be nursed back to health before they could eat a regular meal. So we weren't aware of that. We didn't know that. He said, a guy comes up to you and he says, I'm hungry. You give him food. And that's what we did.
What was the population of the camp?
That I couldn't really answer that. If I were to take a guess, it could have been 5,000, 3,000 to 5,000, that particular camp. And the satellite camps all around there also had populations.
And what kind of preparation did you have for what you were going to discover at Landsberg?
None whatsoever. Nobody knew about this. This was kept a secret by Hitler and the Nazis. This was they didn't want that they were frantically working to try and eliminate that whole facility. But we got there faster than they thought we would, and the people were still there, and they were still being incinerated. Not while we were there, of course. When we pulled in there, everything stopped. And there were dead piled up outside of the incineration ovens.
What were you and your buddies able to share with each other of that experience?
We were affected by it with an intense amount of hatred for the German people for allowing this to happen and allowing it to go on. And as a young soldier, our aim was to destroy and conquer the German army just as quick as we could. We didn't want to take any prisoners. Our motto and the motto of the whole military was kill or be killed. And that's a rather difficult thing to swallow at that age. But we saw death all around us, and when we saw this, it just made us even madder. And we didn't really talk to each other that much, except we understood, once we saw it, where the smell was coming from and what was going on. And then our commanding general, Patton, ordered us to continue chasing the Germans. Don't let them stop running. Just keep going. And we followed orders. We went out straight down the road and continuing until May the 7th when the war ended.
And tell me what happened to you after VE Day, after the war in Europe ended.
Oh, we were assigned as the Army of Occupation. And we had to occupy, the war ended in May, and I didn't start back to the United States until November. And I was transferred back then to a camp called Camp Lucky Strike, which was on the coast of France. And up until that point, we were the guy on the corner with the gun. And the German people, and what was left of the German army, of course, there weren't any young Germans that weren't in the military. Any able-bodied man in Germany was in the military. Well, they were all prisoners of war at that point. So the only thing left were the women and the older folks. And for the most part, they were very nice to us. They were glad that everything was ended, even in spite of the destruction. And our Air Force destroyed a lot of Germany with the bombings.
What experience, if any, did you have with displaced persons camps?
Displaced? You
Yeah.
mean other than
After
Landsberg?
VE Day? Yes.
We ran into a displaced persons camp in which there were 2,300 women in a prison camp, displaced persons. And each one of those displaced persons had created a little flag of their country. And they had that flag after the Germans left. Of course, they wouldn't allow that to happen. But after the Germans left, they each put their flag of their country on their lapel. So you could tell by looking at them what nationality they were. And there were Poles there. There were Germans that were arrested for crimes against the German army. They had about 32 Greek girls there. And I happen to be of Greek descent, and I'm fluent in the language. I speak the language. And when I saw the little Greek flag on their lapels, I communicated with them, and they mobbed me. They were so glad to see somebody from the United States, and then somebody that spoke Greek. Everybody doesn't speak Greek. It's a small country. But we asked them why they were in prison. And they said when Mussolini couldn't conquer Greece because the Greek Evzons pushed them back into Italy, then Hitler went down there with his tanks and his army, and of course Greece was not a match for the German army at all. So they overran Germany, and anybody that had crimes against the German army, they incarcerated them and they threw them in this displaced person camp. And that's the one we ran into. And of course we liberated them, and we were told that they were mixed up criminals and displaced people that were arrested for crimes against the German army, which no longer existed because after a while they were freed. So the problem was for the United States or the Allies to get them back to their homeland. So we were only there 2 or 3 days, and then we kept on going until the end of the war. And we wound up all the way in Innsbruck and hooked up with the Polish army, the Russian army. We met the Russian army and tied in at the southern end of the thing. And the Russians also went into Berlin in the north, and the war ended in May the 8th. I think Hitler committed suicide sometime 5 days before that. When he knew the writing was on the wall, he took a cyanide pill, and then he instructed his butler to burn the bodies, cremate the bodies.
What kind of an influence has the experience at Landsberg been in your life?
Well, I think I'm 85 years old now, and I was 19 and 20 when that occurred, and I still remember it very vividly, and I'll not forget it. But the experience it has been in my life is that as a country, we have to remain strong, and we have to remain free. And if anybody, any country, even looks like they pursue this course of action, I think we have to go after them, which is exactly what we're doing in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And I'm not in favor of any war anywhere. And I think any veteran that's seen combat will say the same thing. We don't want any part of it. But if somebody comes after you and wants to take what you have and what you enjoy, you're not going to stand still. You're going to fight for it. And I still feel that way today. And I think what I saw definitely influenced my attitude toward that. Because there are a lot of people today, my age, that have never seen military service that don't feel that way. They think the war is illegal and it shouldn't happen and we should be out of it. And we should leave the Iranians do what they want and let the Iraqis do what they want, let everybody do what they want. Unfortunately, we can't police the whole world. But we can certainly go after a small group of people that decide they want to take over. And it's generally a minority that rules a country. Hitler was a minority. He was a very small part. But once he got some guns in his possession and he got some Nazis to follow him, then he was no longer a minority. He just killed anybody that got in his way. And that's the way it starts. And I remember that as a young man growing up in New York. I remember that.
How much have you talked about your experience of opening the camp since the war?
Opening?
How much have you spoken about, talked about it?
Oh, you mean...
To friends, to family, in public?
Well, my children now are no longer children. My baby's 42 years old, and I have grandchildren that have graduated college. If they ask questions, I try to answer them, and I try and tell them what's going on. I was instrumental in creating or helping to create our Armored Division Museum, which exists in Abilene, Texas. And we also have a Holocaust room down there which describes the things that we saw in the camp that we liberated. Describes it very vividly. And we have people, young children, 5 years old, 10 years old, school kids, that come in and visit our museum and even have their teachers say, we understand that this really didn't happen. And one of the difficult things we have to do is say, don't ever let anybody tell you that it didn't happen, because it did happen. And we're living proof that it happened, and we have photographs that are not made up. Now, you can do a lot of trick photography today, but that's not trick photography. So we talk about it every opportunity we can. It's an integral part of our museum and our experience as an armored division, because we were the first to liberate any concentration camp in Germany. And then many followed that immediately, because they were all, a lot of them in that area.
Tell me how the experience in Landsberg related to the history of your family.
Oh, okay. My mother and father were both born in Smyrna, Turkey. And back in the 20s and before, all the way back to the days of Alexander the Great, Smyrna, Turkey, that portion of Turkey was called Asia Minor. And Asia Minor was in fact Greece. That whole area that was conquered by Alexander the Great was all Greek-speaking. And the population of Smyrna, Turkey, where my mother lived and my father lived, was all Greek-speaking. Very little Turkish was spoken in the streets. And in 1922, the Turks decided that they didn't like that. That they felt that that land there belonged to them. So Ataturk got on his horse and started what we refer to as another Holocaust, which occurred in 1922. They actually overran and chased out the Greek army. They killed 1 million Armenians. And somebody told me, I don't recall if you told me, that this Sunday evening they're going to air on 60 Minutes the Armenian massacre. There were something like 1 million Armenians, and there were also about 1 million Greeks were exterminated by the Turks in Turkey. And my mother, at age 16, was a refugee. And she fortunately got out somehow on a ship and went back to Athens. My dad was already in the United States. He was 10 years older, and he had come to the United States to study. And he was going to Columbia University and studied to be an engineer. But he went back to Greece to practice his engineering, and he knew the family. My mother's maiden name was Christopher, and he knew the Christopher family. It's not said that way in Greek, but that's good enough. And he met them in Athens, and he saw this little girl that the last time he saw her was 9 years old, and now she was 19. And he said, well, she's a whole lot different. So they decided to get married in 1924. And when she became pregnant, she was in her 6th month of pregnancy, and my dad said, I don't think we want to raise a family over here because all they're doing over here is civil war and they're fighting all the time. Let's go to the United States. And in her 9th month of pregnancy, my mother got on a ship with my dad after they had a brief honeymoon through Paris and Madrid, Spain, and London, England, and all that. They got on a ship and they went back to New York, and 2 weeks later, I was born in New York. So I am a citizen by birth. That wasn't intentional, but that's the way it happened.
Tell me how much you were able to tell your parents about the concentration camp in Germany when you returned.
I wasn't. I wasn't able to communicate all of it. I told them that we had seen it, and we realized what they were doing, and it made us extremely angry, and we didn't want any Germans to live, which is wrong, but as long as they were wearing a uniform, they were fair game. That was the army, and we were in the army, and that's what our job was. We had to exterminate the German army, and that's what we did. But my dad was not. He was 4F because his eyes were pretty bad, and they wouldn't accept him in the military back in 1914. So he was declared 4F, and it was a cross to bear for him. But when I left, they didn't relish the thought because they knew what war was. They had seen it firsthand.
When did you leave military service?
1945, the end of 1945, December. And, it was January. I was discharged in January 1946. So I served from 1943 to 1946, almost 3 complete years.
What would you like to tell young people today about what they can do as individuals?
Young people today, and we're trying to do that as an educational process, as you are here with your Holocaust Museum. Our museum has just one little room that's Holocaust. But we are telling the story of why we fought and what motivated us to fight. Why? I mean, we were told that's what we had to do and we followed orders. But still, why did we fight? And we can answer that in one 4-letter word: free. We want to be free. We don't want someone telling us what to do. And if there's any key at all to the military and to the United States, it's freedom. We're one of the last surviving free countries in the world. I don't call China free. I think Australia follows a close second. England is a monarchy, basically. They have a king and a queen and all that, and they have a parliament too. France is more or less a dictatorship. None of the South American countries are what we call free. Chavez is Argentina, Brazil, dictatorships, and they have a tendency to get out of hand. Look at Cuba, Castro. I went to Cuba in 1956 when, before Castro, and before he took over. And he took over militarily with a small group of people that were armed. And the rules are the guy on the corner that's got the gun. That's who makes the rules. And once you let somebody on the corner with the gun that has bad intentions, you're going to lose your freedom. You're going to do what they say. And the Americans, so far, for the most part, are not like that. We can still go anywhere. We can talk. I'm free to talk right now about anything I want. I can condemn the government. I can praise the government. I can say whatever I want to, and I'm not incriminated for it. And woe is me if that day ever comes when they start to try and sew up your lips so that you can't speak. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to go and do whatever you want, wherever you want. So if I have said this to my kids and my grandkids more than once. In fact, they kind of look at me and they say, oh, here comes another war story. I say, no, this isn't a war story. You got to believe that we want in this country total freedom. We don't want the government dictating everything to us. We want to be free, and we want the government to represent us and our wishes. So we need to stay militarily strong, and I would advocate military conscription for everybody, every able-bodied individual, women, men, what have you. I think it's a good thing. The discipline that you learn, and the fact that should there be a conflict, we're there to defend what we feel is right. So I would advise the young people to be very careful about eliminating our military and turning over too many jobs to the government. We have states, 48 states. Looks like they've tried to do that in Europe with the European Union, and it doesn't seem to be working because you've got a group of people called the Pigs, which is Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, those 4 countries. And they are in debt, and they're having a hard time struggling with the euro. Now, Italy had the lira, Spain had the peseta, their own currency. France had the franc, the French franc. Greece had the drachma. They all had their own currency, and they all had a uniqueness about them that identified them as Greece and Spain and Portugal and so on. But the European Union tried to wipe that out and call it the euro, which everybody has a euro in those 4 countries that I named. Now they've got a problem. Whether the euro is going to succeed or not, I don't know. I would think we were better off before. And I think my relatives, I have 5, 6 first cousins in Athens, Greece, living today. And of course they have children that are grown. They're all younger than I am over there. I'm the oldest one of the bunch. But I have 5 first cousins. I make the 6th. And we talk to them and we visit them. We were just there last fall. They still don't like the euro. They think it hurt their country. So that's just one person's opinion. But it's my opinion that I would like to see Italy and Greece and Spain and Portugal go back to their own currency and act as individual countries rather than states with one common. They're trying to mimic the United States and it didn't work.
Tell me how you would like to see American youth, in particular, change after hearing your story.
Well, there are a lot of youth that just don't believe they should be in the military. They don't believe in service. Now, Greece, and just speaking from what I know, the country of Greece, up until very recently, has had mandatory military service. If you weren't in school and had a deferment, you had to serve. It used to be 2 years, but now I think they've cut it down to 1 year or a year and a half. You had to serve 1 year in the military. And all of my first cousins, with the exception of the female, served in the Greek military, and I don't think it hurt them one bit. And it made Greece a little bit stronger for their service. And I think, and it's just again my opinion only, I think all young people should have the military experience. I think it's good for them. It's not that they're going to go out and kill somebody. That's not the object. But the object is that if somebody comes after you, you'll be ready for them. And it teaches you that.
Thank you for sharing your story and your thoughts.
You're entirely welcome. My pleasure.
Okay. Tell us where that picture was taken.
Well, the picture was taken after I was discharged from the military. It was probably taken in St. Louis after I got home in uniform. But you notice I've got 2 stripes. That's a corporal at that time. The military is a little different now. This braid around my shoulder is a French decoration called a Croix de Guerre. And that was put on us by the French Army and one of the officers of the French Army, and they kissed us on both cheeks, which we weren't accustomed to at all. But that is the French custom. Incidentally, the Greeks do the same thing. You know, when I see my cousins over there, we got to kiss the men on both cheeks.
European.
And it's European custom, right.
And you were awarded that for what?
And we were awarded that because we fought with the French Second Army, I believe it was, in one particular area in Europe.
And the 12?
And the 12 is the 12th Armored Division. There were 16 armored divisions commissioned during the Second World War, each armored division containing 12,000 men. So that's almost 250,000 men in the armored divisions. Not quite, just a little bit less. So let me show you what I was in, which is, if you have not seen it, this is a representation of a Sherman tank. The turret turns, 70,000 pounds of .50 caliber machine gun mounted right by the turret that the tank commander could get out and stand on the back and fire. That, by the way, is an anti-aircraft weapon also, the .50 caliber, and it's still in use today. That same exact gun that is manufactured is still in use in today's military. This tank is not. The tank has been modified. The gun that we had then was 3 inches. It's 76 millimeter, is 3 inches. Today's cannon is 120 millimeter. So that's almost 6 inches. And to give you an idea of how destructive these vehicles can be, we can drive through a building and not even slow down. And we did that in many instances. We drove through brick buildings. Of course, we closed our hatches so we wouldn't get the bricks on our head. The driver and assistant driver are located in the front. The gunner, which I served, is located in the front compartment of the turret. The tank commander stands right behind him in this little place right here. And the loader is on this side of the cannon that can load the shells. And to give you an idea, we carried 110 rounds of 76 millimeter ammunition for the cannon. 110 rounds.
Is that the shell?
This one. No. That's small stuff. We carried 10,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, which fit this gun right here. 10,000 rounds. This is fired in the M1A3, the M1 rifle, the M1 Garand. This is a 30 caliber gun, not machine gun, 30 caliber rifle bullet. These will kill you. There were many men wounded with a 30 caliber, but you know, you can be hit in the leg, or it depends on where your injury is, whether you survive it or not. But we had 30,000 rounds in this tank of this ammunition. So this was no match for infantry. We had a number of times we had infantry try to attack us without any anti-tank weapons at all. And it was just suicide. They'd just come up there and This thing would traverse, we could traverse 360 degrees in 15 seconds, all the way around. And a 30 caliber coaxial machine gun in the turret, and another 30 caliber that was called the bow gun in the front. So 2 30 caliber machine guns firing at infantry in front of you. And of course, when there's that much lead flying around, you didn't get out of the vehicle. One instance, if I can share with you, as we started to get into Germany, the German villages are small. They might be 4,000, 6,000 population. They all had white flags draped on their windows. They were surrendering. The first few villages that we approached in Germany, after we saw the concentration camps, keep in mind, we were still that mindset that these people had killed all of these people, innocent people, men, women, children, everything. We were still pretty mad about that routine. When we pulled into a village that had all white flags in there, thinking that the Germans were surrendering that village to us, if we got partway in there and a sniper or a German soldier that was left behind killed one of our men, we stopped immediately, turned around and got out of that village, lined the tanks up, leveled it. With all it took was about a platoon of tanks and 3-inch cannon. We just literally destroyed the village. Then we went in after we destroyed it and drove through the houses, one after the other, never even slowing down. That's how destructive this vehicle is. You don't want to be in front of it. And this, I got a kick out of this Saving Private Ryan by Steven Spielberg. It was so overdone that a man was standing in front of the tank challenging it with a .45 pistol. It was a joke.
Wouldn't have happened.
Yeah. But anyway, it's extremely destructive piece of equipment. And today's vehicle is even more so, because we had a trouble firing this while we were moving. But today's vehicle, they log on to a target and it's all automatic. The shells go right where they put them, automatically. So that's enough of that vehicle to give you an idea. This, if one of these hits you, it's all over. Anywhere. If one of these hits you, you have a chance of surviving. And the Germans had very similar weaponry, by the way. So I can talk a little about how mad we were. By the way, we only leveled one village, and the word spread to the other villages. You better not harbor any German men, whether they're your uncles, your brothers, or what. You better not harbor any German soldiers if you want your village destroyed, because this is what they'll do. You kill one of these men in that battalion or that division, and they'll back off and they'll completely destroy that village. We did it once, and we didn't like to do it, because it's not in our nature, the American nature, to kill women and children. We just don't do it. And we didn't do it during the war over there. We didn't deliberately aim for women or aim for children when we saw them. They were different. But if there were able-bodied men, whether they were in uniform or not, they were history. And all of that, this created a large part of that mental attitude. And this is a picture when we drove into Landsberg. This is a picture of what we saw. And we didn't really have to see it. We could smell it. And we were pretty used to smelling the odors of war, because we had men killed around us all the time. But this was horrible, because there were a number of days old. Some, if you can imagine, some were still alive in this area.
Amongst the dead.
Amongst the dead, yeah. They didn't care. They didn't care. They starved them. They were starving them.
When you published this issue of the Hellcat News, that was published in 2008.
April 2008.
What was the reaction to that publication?
Well, we published it among ourselves, among our division members, and we all knew that. Now, one reaction, my son, who is right now 52 years old, so in '08 he was a couple of years younger, I asked him to help me with this picture because he's pretty good with photography, you know. I said, I want to screen this picture and put it on the cover. And he said to me, at age 48, he said, Dad, you're not going to put that on the front page of your issue, are you? And I said, I certainly am. It happened. And it happened to me. And it happened to those people who are a lot worse off than I am. I'm still here. So what I said was indescribable horror is exactly what it was. It was indescribable. And it's hard even today to tell somebody what we saw and to visualize that we saw all this. Now, immediately we were ordered, within hours after the generals got to Landsberg, we were ordered to keep chasing the Germans, so we had to leave immediately. Our rear echelon, the headquarters companies and the artillery companies that always lagged behind the fighting companies, which were the tanks, the infantry, and the artillery, stayed back, and they recruited the German civilians from the various areas around this concentration camp and brought them out there and had them digging. In fact, they're pictured digging holes to bury their dead. So it was mass burial. That was the only thing you could do at the time. So on the inside of the publication, it shows the ovens and the civilians. The ovens in this picture with the people that they had recruited to do that job. They just told them, hey, we want you to push the people into these ovens. And they were people that were Jewish. And they said, if you don't do it, we'll kill you.
That's part of Landsberg.
That's part of Landsberg. This is all Landsberg. And the pile-high stacks outside the crematorium. And then this is the burial details that we recruited, our headquarters people recruited to get the people to bury the dead. And they didn't object to doing it, and but they would never admit that they knew this place existed. And that was very hard for us to believe. Very hard. Because they knew the Jewish people were flagged with a star, the Star of David on their lapel. They were all identified Jewish, and they were disappearing all over Germany. They were disappearing. People didn't know where they went. They ran trains into these places by the train loads, and they were engaged in extermination. So it's a pretty horrible scene. We don't want anybody ever doing that. But how are you going to stop them? You have to be militarily strong. That's my idea. You can't do it with diplomacy. Or we could have done it with the Japanese. We could have done it with Hitler. We could have done it with any number of people. It just doesn't work. There comes a point where they decide that diplomacy is broken down and we're just going to take what we want. And that's when you better be ready. Okay? Again, if I were to tell our young people anything, it's freedom is not free. And this issue was in July of 2008, and it says we were having a military reunion in Abilene, Texas, where our museum is, and I said, if you're coming to the reunion, ask any one of the 12th veterans to tell you what the price of freedom really is. Chances are he wears some of the scars of battle, and he lost several of his comrades in arms. He knows the price of freedom. And if there's any way to communicate that to the young people, that would be my wish, that they would understand what they have, because they're living in it and they don't see it. They don't know that somebody tells them to be quiet, that you can't say that or you can't criticize that. you can't have an opinion without maybe going to jail. That's what they do in the foreign countries. In Germany, they just exterminated them.
Tell me about this journal, this publication.
Well, this publication was initiated in 1946. Our Armored Division was disbanded in 1946, the 12th Armored Division. After serving in Europe as the Army of Occupation, it was no longer useful. So the military closed it out. And we continued it as an association, which lasts to this day. And to this day, we have 1,040, well, this one says 1,200 because it was '08, but we have today 1,040 living veterans of the 12th Armored Division in this country. And we have a couple of them overseas that elected to move to England and to Australia. But this is a publication that I happen to be the editor of, and I only did it because the editor that we had was a professional editor, and he called me up one day about 4 years ago and said, I can't do this anymore. He was about a year older than I am, so he was kind of losing it mentally and everything, and he said, can you get somebody? And at the time, I was president of the association. And I said, well, I'll try. And I couldn't find anyone, so I decided to do it myself. And I've never done this before. But I kind of enjoy it.
How frequently is that published?
This is published every month. And it consists of about anywhere from 24 to 28 pages. Now, there are 15 battalions in an armored division. And I have a reporter for every single battalion that tells me the story of their particular battalion. And each month I get a report from each battalion. And from that I put the paper together. And it keeps the men informed that are still living of what's going on in their particular units. And it's one of the things, one of the pieces of glue that holds our association together. So it's a very valuable publication in my mind.
Thank you for sharing.
The other one is July of 2009, is a little more current. I think this was after our election. And I guess it's a little political, intimating a present form of government. And I just felt that God help our nation, because we got the wrong people trying to tell us what to do. Tell us too much, and I don't want to get too political. You can knock it out if you want. But during the Second World War in 44 and 45, the 12th Armored fought all in the name of freedom. And after we saw what they did to the people in Landsberg, it just drove us even harder to get the war over with and get to Berlin. We weren't going to Berlin, but the Third Army was going to Berlin. And the Russians were coming from the other way to get there. So General Patch had us link up with the Russians at Innsbruck and then beyond. Forgot the name of the town now, but we hooked up with the Russians, and they were quite an operation. So that's our publication. Every month, it takes a little bit of work to put it together. And I guess I'm fortunate that I'm able to do that. I see a lot of fellows my age that they're looking at the grass from the other side. They're not alive anymore. And I have to write the obituaries every month. And in this month we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 men pass away. And it's anywhere from 6 to 12 every month in our particular division of what's left of the 1,040 men that we still have living. We're losing some every day.
Yes.
So we are making every effort we can to perpetuate our museum in Abilene, Texas, and
Preserve your
get some
history.
local people that are younger, of course, because how much longer are we all going to live? At 85, I don't know what my life expectancy is. We have some men in our division that are 100 already. They've turned 100. Maybe I'll go that long, I don't know. I'm just hoping that it's a functional life and a useful life, and that I can do something to communicate what happened years ago, and how to the younger generation, and how we can prevent it from happening again. And it may not be easy. So, during the Holocaust that occurred in many prison camps in Germany, my information says that there were 20 million Russians that were killed.
During the Nazi Holocaust.
Exterminated, yeah. And there were 10 million Christians and 6 million Jewish people and 1,900 Catholic priests. That for no reason they were annihilated. These weren't bad people. These were just day-to-day citizens. We can't allow anybody to do this. And if anybody decides to take up arms and come after, and they're making those kind of threats all the time, we need to have our intelligent community wide awake so that we don't have another 9/11 like they had in New York, and that we don't have any other disasters in this country like they had in England and in Spain. We have to catch up with the people that are doing this and hopefully eliminate them. This is nothing more than our insignia here of our association. By the way, we have two distinct corporations. One is the 12th Armored Division Association, which is a corporation, and the other is the 12th Armored Division Museum, Memorial Museum, which is our museum in Abilene, Texas. And they are two separate corporations, although the veterans are the same. With the museum and with the association. We're the same group of people. I've been trying to combine them for 5 years, but for some reason the guys don't want to do that. I don't know why. That's it. I think you have everything. This is just
again,
a repeat
thank you
of this.
For sharing.
You're entirely
So
welcome.
much.
And
I just have one follow-up question. When you went through the wall, were there any of the guards left, or did they all dispersed?
I thought I heard you say that.
yeah, we asked the prisoners.
Yeah.
We asked the prisoners right away, are there any Germans here? And they said, oh no. They saw you coming and they left. In fact, right outside of the gates, they had an encounter with a German a command car, a tank ran up against a little German command car that the Germans thought that this was still in their possession. And they drove up to it, and of course the tank saw them and they fired at them, and they killed both of the officers that were in the command car.
That was unusual.
And that occurred right before we went through that wall. We were there at the time. Some
You
of our
saw
tanks
this?
were the ones that did that.
You saw that happen?
No, I didn't see it. I was on the other side of the prison. We went,
Yeah.
this was a pretty big facility, this
Yeah.
prison. But we went through one side of it.
Yes. And you've described that.
And we were the lead tank. We were one of the lead tanks that headed in there. So
All right.
they all followed us through the same hole, and we realized that there wasn't any resistance there, that they were all prisoners of war. We didn't know if they were criminals,
Well,
nationalities,
Prisoners of wars denotes they were in the service.
well,
They
no,
weren't-
they weren't that kind of
Yeah,
prisoner of war.
right.
They were imprisoned
They were imprisoned,
Jewish
yeah.
people, yeah.
Yeah.
Men, women, and children. They weren't prisoners of war. Prisoners of war were military. Okay, when we broke through the wall at Landsberg, we had no idea what would be on the other side of it. And the first order I received was from my tank commander. He said, John, turn the gun around. Because if you look at the gun, it protrudes beyond the front deck of the tank. So we wouldn't want to hit a wall with a cannon. We wanted to hit it with the tracks and with the front of the tank. So I immediately turned the tank gun, 180 degrees. And he said, okay, here we go. And we were driving maybe 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, and we hit the wall and nobody even knew we hit it. We just felt a little up-down motion, and we got inside and we saw all these people. And we didn't know what they were, and we deduced that they were prisoners. We didn't see immediately the dead that were lined up along the side ready to be cremated. But these people were all prisoners of the Germans. And they were, for the large part, Jewish and whatever other nationalities were mixed in there. They were not prisoners of war. They were just regular people that walked the streets and happened to be anti-German. Not only Poles, but Jews, I'm sure Russians, and any other nationality that happened to be around that didn't like what the Germans were doing.